The dust never settled in Copper Ridge. It hung in the air like unspoken words, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that matched the town's weathered soul. Sheriff Tom Brennan stood on the wooden porch of his office, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he watched his son walk down Main Street. At 17, Samuel Brennan moved through the world like a ghost. His boots made no sound on the wooden sidewalks, not because he stepped lightly, but because people simply didn't notice him anymore. The boy who had never spoken a word had become invisible to most folks in Copper Ridge. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the dirt road into a shimmering haze. Samuel's dark hair caught the light as he paused outside Henderson's general store, watching the bustle of daily life through eyes that seemed older than his years. Mrs. Henderson emerged, her arms full of flour sacks. "Samuel, honey," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone people used with him, louder than necessary, as if his muteness had somehow affected his hearing. "You helping your pa today?" Samuel nodded once, a barely perceptible movement that Mrs. Henderson had learned to interpret over the years. She smiled, but it never quite reached her eyes. There was always that hint of pity, that uncomfortable shifting that came when people didn't know how to fill the silence he carried with him. Sheriff Brennan felt his chest tighten as he watched the interaction from across the street. 17 years of watching his boy navigate a world that didn't understand him. 17 years of wondering what thoughts lived behind those intelligent eyes, what dreams he might have, what fears kept him awake at night. The Silver Dollar Saloon sat at the far end of Main Street, its batwing doors swinging lazily in the hot breeze. Even in the afternoon heat, the sound of piano music and rough laughter drifted out onto the street. Samuel's gaze always lingered there, not with the curiosity of a young man drawn to vice, but with something else entirely. "Boy sees something the rest of us don't," muttered old Pete Kowalski from his perch outside the barber shop. He was whittling a piece of cedar, the shavings falling like snow onto the dusty boards. "Been watching that place like he's waiting for something." Sheriff Brennan stepped down from his porch, his spurs jangling softly. "Samuel's got his mother's eyes," he said quietly. "She always saw the good in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves." Mary Brennan had died when Samuel was 7. Taken by the fever that swept through Copper Ridge one brutal winter. The boy had been quiet before, but after her death, the silence became absolute. Tom sometimes wondered if his son blamed himself, if somehow the weight of grief had stolen his voice, along with his childhood innocence. The wind picked up, sending a tumbleweed rolling down the center of Main Street. Samuel turned his head to follow its path, and for a moment his father caught a glimpse of something in his expression. A longing, perhaps, or a deep sadness that seemed far too heavy for someone so young. Inside the Silver Dollar, the afternoon crowd was settling in for what would likely be a long evening of drinking and card-playing. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the scent of whiskey. But beneath it all was something else, the smell of hard work and honest sweat, of leather and dust, and the dreams that men carried in their pockets. Rosa Martinez moved between the tables with a worn rag in her hand, wiping down surfaces that would be dirty again within minutes. At 42, she had the kind of face that spoke of a life lived fully, lines around her eyes from both laughter and tears, hands that showed the calluses of endless work, but a gentleness in her movements that suggested an unbroken spirit. She had come to Copper Ridge 3 years ago, arriving on the noon stage, with nothing but a small satchel and a letter of recommendation from a church in Santa Fe. The Silver Dollar's owner, Big Jim Morrison, had hired her on the spot, not because of her credentials, but because something in her manner suggested she could handle whatever the saloon might throw at her. "Rosa, table 6 needs another bottle," called out Maggie O'Brien, one of the saloon girls. Rosa nodded, setting down her cleaning rag to retrieve the whiskey. She moved efficiently, but without hurry, her worn brown dress rustling softly as she navigated between the tables. Few of the patrons acknowledged her presence. She was part of the background, like the scuffed wooden floors or the faded paintings on the walls, but Rosa didn't seem to mind the invisibility. If anything, she seemed to prefer it, moving through her duties with a quiet dignity that commanded its own kind of respect. Through the window, she could see the sheriff's son standing on the sidewalk, his attention focused on something down the street. She had noticed him before, this silent young man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. There was something in his stillness that spoke to her, a recognition of shared understanding about what it meant to be overlooked. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel made his way slowly back toward the sheriff's office. His father was inside now, reviewing wanted posters and updating his logbook. The routine was familiar. Samuel would sit in the corner chair, sometimes helping to organize papers or clean the rifles, always present but never speaking. "Good day today," Sheriff Brennan said, not really expecting an answer. "Mrs. Patterson's chickens got loose again. Took me near an hour to round them up." He glanced at his son, hoping for some sign of amusement, but Samuel's expression remained unchanged. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to set the desert on fire. From the saloon, the sounds of evening revelry were beginning to build. Louder voices, more laughter, the occasional shout of excitement over a winning hand of poker. Samuel stood at the window, watching the light fade from the day. In a few hours, the silver dollar would be at its busiest, and Rosa Martinez would be moving between the tables, invisible to most, but somehow essential to the rhythm of the place. There was something about her presence that drew his attention, though he couldn't have explained what it was, even if he'd had the words. Sheriff Brennan closed his logbook and looked at his son. "You want to head home? Maria's probably got dinner ready." Maria Vasquez, their housekeeper, had been with them since Mary's death, providing the kind of steady presence that had helped keep their small family together. Samuel nodded, but he remained at the window for another long moment, his gaze fixed on the saloon doors. Something was stirring inside him, a restlessness he'd never felt before, as if the silence he'd carried for so long was beginning to feel less like protection and more like a prison. As they walked home together, father and son, the dust of Main Street settled behind them, but the questions that hung in the air between them remained as unsettled as ever. The morning came early to Copper Ridge, announced by the distant whistle of the 6:15 freight train and the crowing of roosters from the homesteads that dotted the outskirts of town. Rosa Martinez was already at the silver dollar, her hands working methodically as she prepared for another day. The saloon in the morning light looked different than it did at night, smaller somehow, more vulnerable. The magic of lamplight and whiskey couldn't hide the worn spots in the floorboards or the chips in the paint, but Rosa had learned to see beauty in imperfection, to find dignity in the work that others might consider beneath them. She was sweeping near the front window when she noticed him, the sheriff's son, standing across the street next to the horse trough. He wasn't looking directly at the saloon, but there was something in his posture that suggested awareness, as if he was listening to something the rest of the world couldn't hear. "That boy's been standing there near 20 minutes now," observed Jake Reynolds, the Silver Dollar's bartender, as he polished glasses behind the bar. "You think something's wrong with him?" Rosa paused in her sweeping. "Nothing wrong with being thoughtful," she said quietly. Her voice carried a slight accent, the remnant of her childhood in New Mexico, but her English was clear and precise. "Maybe he's just figuring things out." Jake shrugged. "If you say so. Just seems peculiar is all." Samuel was indeed thinking, though his thoughts came not in words, but in feelings and images that seemed to shift like shadows on a wall. He found himself drawn to this place, to the rhythm of life that pulsed within its walls, but most of all, to the woman who moved through it all with such quiet grace. He had been watching her for weeks now, not in any inappropriate way, but with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a puzzle. While others ignored her or treated her as furniture, Samuel saw something different. He saw the way she paused to wipe a child's face when a family passed through town. He saw her leave small pieces of bread on the windowsill for the stray cats. He saw her genuine smile when old Mrs. Chen struggled with her English at the general store. There was kindness in her that seemed to exist without expectation of return, and it fascinated him in a way he couldn't explain. Sheriff Brennan noticed his son's new habit of lingering near the saloon, but he said nothing. The boy had so few interests that Tom was reluctant to discourage any behavior that seemed to give him purpose, even if he couldn't understand what that purpose might be. "Morning, Samuel," said Dr. Harrison, as he passed by on his way to tend to a sick child on the other side of town. The doctor had examined Samuel many times over the years, trying to find some physical reason for his silence, but had always concluded that the boy's muteness was something deeper than medicine could address. Samuel nodded his greeting and Dr. Harrison paused. "You know, son, your mother used to say that some people are meant to listen more than they speak. Maybe you're just taking your time to make sure you have something worth saying." The words hit Samuel with unexpected force. He had never thought of his silence as a choice, had always felt it as a burden or a failing. But the idea that it might be something else entirely, a preparation of sorts, made something shift inside his chest. Inside the Silver Dollar, Rosa was preparing for the lunch crowd. She moved between the tables, straightening chairs and checking that each surface was clean. Her movements were economical, practiced, but there was something almost dance-like in the way she navigated the space. "Rosa," called Big Jim Morrison from behind the bar. At 6'4" and nearly 300 pounds, Big Jim was an imposing figure, but those who knew him understood that his bark was considerably worse than his bite. "We're expecting a big crowd tonight. Railroad crews coming through, and you know how those boys get." Rosa nodded. Railroad crews meant long hours and difficult customers, men who had been away from civilization too long and forgot their manners after a few drinks. But it also meant good tips, and Rosa was saving every penny she could. "I'll make sure everything's ready," she said simply. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel found himself walking past the saloon more frequently. He told himself he was just helping his father patrol the town, but the truth was more complicated. There was something about Rosa's presence that made him feel less alone in his silence. It was during one of these walks that he witnessed something that would stay with him for days. A well-dressed stranger had come into the saloon, a man in an expensive suit who carried himself with the arrogance of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Rosa was serving him lunch when he suddenly grabbed her wrist. "This steak's overdone, girl," he said loudly, his voice carrying easily through the saloon. "Take it back and bring me something fit for a civilized man." Rosa remained calm, but Samuel could see the tension in her shoulders. "Of course, sir. I'll have the cook prepare another. And be quick about it. I don't have all day to wait for incompetent help to figure out how to do their jobs." The other patrons in the saloon shifted uncomfortably, but none of them spoke up. This was the way of things. Customers had the right to complain, and working people had to take it with good grace. But as Samuel watched Rosa return to the kitchen, her dignity intact despite the public humiliation, something inside him began to burn. Not anger exactly, but something fiercer and more protective. For the first time in his life, he wanted desperately to speak, to defend someone who couldn't defend herself without risking her livelihood. The moment passed. The stranger ate his second steak without further complaint and left town on the evening stage. Rosa cleaned up after him, as she did after every customer, without complaint or visible resentment. But Samuel had seen the slight tremor in her hands as she cleared the table, had noticed the way she took a deep breath before continuing with her work. That evening, as the saloon filled with its usual crowd, Samuel found himself standing outside again. Through the window, he could see Rosa moving between the tables, serving drinks and cleaning up spills. The railroad crew had indeed arrived, and they were living up to their reputation for rowdiness. Sheriff Brennan appeared at his elbow. "You've been spending a lot of time over here lately." Samuel looked at his father, and for a moment, Tom thought he might actually speak. There was something different in his son's eyes, an intensity that hadn't been there before. "That woman," Tom continued, following Samuel's gaze through the window. "Rosa Martinez. She's good people. Came here from Santa Fe after her husband died. Works harder than most men I know. Never causes any trouble." Samuel nodded, but his attention remained fixed on the scene inside the saloon. Rosa was serving a table of railroad workers who were clearly several drinks past polite. One of them reached out and patted her arm as she set down their bottles, and while she didn't pull away, Samuel could see her stiffen. "She doesn't deserve that," Tom said quietly, as if reading his son's thoughts. "But there's not much law can do about rudeness, as long as they don't cross the line into something worse." For the first time in his life, Samuel felt the inadequacy of silence in a way that was almost physical. There were things that needed to be said, protections that needed to be offered, kindness that needed to be returned, but the words remained locked inside him, as unreachable as stars. As they walked home together, Samuel's mind was full of images. Rosa's gentle hands as she worked, the way she never seemed to lose her patience despite how she was treated, the quiet dignity she maintained even when others failed to show her respect. That night, as he lay in his bed listening to the distant sounds of the town settling down for sleep, Samuel made a decision that would change everything. He didn't have words for it yet. Words were still foreign territory, but he knew with absolute certainty that Rosa Martinez deserved better than the invisibility the world had forced upon her. And somehow, someday, he was going to find a way to let her know that she had been seen. The desert heat of late August settled over Copper Ridge like a heavy blanket, making the air shimmer with mirages and turning every breath into an effort. It had been 3 weeks since Samuel began what he thought of as his vigil, though he wouldn't have called it that, having no words for the complex feelings that drew him to the silver dollar day after day. Rosa had begun to notice him. How could she not? The tall, silent young man who stood across the street, never staring directly, but somehow always aware of what was happening inside the saloon. At first she had wondered if she should be concerned, but there was nothing threatening in his presence. If anything, she found it oddly comforting, as if someone was finally seeing her as more than just part of the furniture. "That boy's taken quite a shine to watching this place," observed Maggie O'Brien, as she prepared for another evening shift. Maggie was one of the few saloon girls who had ever bothered to learn Rosa's name, and their friendship had developed slowly over the years, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of what it meant to be a woman making her own way in a hard world. Rosa glanced out the window where Samuel stood in his usual spot. "He's not causing any trouble." "Didn't say he was," Maggie replied, adjusting her dress and checking her appearance in the cracked mirror behind the bar. "Just noting that someone's got an interest. Question is, what kind of interest?" Rosa didn't answer immediately. She had been wondering the same thing herself. In her experience, young men who lingered around saloons usually wanted one of two things. Either they were working up the courage to cause trouble, or they were fascinated by the women who worked there. But Samuel seemed different. His attention felt protective rather than predatory, concerned rather than curious. The afternoon brought its usual parade of customers. Miners finishing their shifts, cowboys passing through town, merchants conducting business. Rosa moved among them all with her characteristic efficiency, but today she found herself more aware of the window, of the silent figure who stood beyond it. It was nearly evening when trouble arrived, in the form of Wade Morrison, Big Jim's nephew from back east. Wade was everything his uncle wasn't, narrow-shouldered, mean-spirited, and possessed of the particular cruelty that came from too much money and too little character. He'd been in town for a week, supposedly learning the family business, but mostly he'd been drinking and making himself disagreeable to anyone who couldn't fight back. "Rosa!" he called out as he stumbled through the bat-wing doors, already drunk despite the early hour. "Bring me a bottle of the good stuff, not that rot-gut you serve the rabble." Rosa set down the glasses she'd been cleaning and moved to comply with his request. She had learned to navigate men like Wade, to be efficient without being friendly, to provide service without invitation for further interaction. But Wade was feeling particularly malicious this evening. As Rosa set the bottle on his table, he grabbed her wrist with a grip that was just short of painful. "You know, for a cleaning woman, you're not entirely hideous," he said, his words slurred but his intent clear. "Maybe you and I should discuss your future employment opportunities." "I'm quite satisfied with my current position, thank you," Rosa replied calmly, trying to extract her wrist from his grip without causing a scene. "Are you now?" Wade's grip tightened. "Well, maybe it's time you learned to be more appreciative of the opportunities this establishment provides." Outside, Samuel had been watching the interaction through the window with growing alarm. He could see the tension in Rosa's posture, could see her trying to maintain her dignity while dealing with Wade's unwanted attention. Something was building inside him, a pressure that felt like steam in a closed kettle. Inside the saloon, Big Jim had noticed what was happening, but he was torn between his family loyalty and his respect for Rosa. Wade was his brother's son, visiting from Philadelphia, and family complications ran deep. But Rosa was a good worker, and she didn't deserve this treatment. "Wade," Big Jim called out, his voice carrying a warning, "leave the lady be." Wade laughed, a sound without humor. "Lady? Uncle Jim, I think you've been out in this desert sun too long if you think a Mexican cleaning woman qualifies as a lady." The saloon fell silent. Even the piano player stopped mid-song. Rosa's face flushed, not with embarrassment, but with the kind of quiet anger that comes from a lifetime of enduring such slights. "Let go of me," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Or what?" Wade tightened his grip further. "You'll quit. Go ahead. See how far that gets you in this godforsaken town." That's when Samuel moved. He didn't remember deciding to enter the saloon. One moment he was standing on the sidewalk watching through the window, and the next he was pushing through the batwing doors, his boots echoing on the wooden floor as every eye in the place turned toward him. The silence was absolute. Sheriff Brennan's mute son in the Silver Dollar Saloon was unprecedented enough. The look on his face, intense, focused, almost dangerous, was something none of them had ever seen before. Wade, still gripping Rosa's wrist, looked up with drunken confusion. Well, well, if it isn't the sheriff's pet mute. Come to watch the show?" Samuel moved closer, his presence somehow commanding despite his silence. He was tall for his age, and 3 years of working alongside his father had given him the kind of lean strength that came from real work rather than gymnasium exercises. "Cat got your tongue, boy?" Wade laughed at his own wit. "Oh, wait, I forgot. Cat got your tongue permanently." Samuel reached Wade's table and simply stood there, his eyes moving from Wade's face to where the man's hand gripped Rosa's wrist, then back again. The message was clear to everyone in the room, even without words. "You got something to say to me, dummy?" Wade's voice rose, encouraged by what he mistook for Samuel's passive stance. "Because if you do, you better find your voice real quick." Rosa looked up at Samuel, and for a moment their eyes met. In his face, she saw something she had rarely encountered in her life, pure, protective rage on her behalf. Not possessive or self-serving, but genuinely concerned for her well-being. It was the look of someone who saw her as worthy of respect and was prepared to defend that principle. "Please," she said quietly to Samuel, "it's all right. I can handle this." But Samuel shook his head slightly, never taking his eyes off Wade. The pressure inside him was building to an unbearable level. For 17 years he had watched the world from the outside, had seen cruelty and kindness in equal measure, had observed the strong taking advantage of the weak. But he had never felt moved to action, had never felt that his intervention might matter. This was different. Rosa mattered. Wade, interpreting Samuel's silence as weakness, made his fatal mistake. "You know what, boy? Since you seem so interested in the help, maybe you should know what kind of woman she really is. Maybe I should tell you what a little money can buy in a place like this." The words hit Rosa like a physical blow. She had endured many insults over the years, but there was something particularly cruel about having her dignity attacked in front of someone whose opinion had come to matter to her. And that's when something inside Samuel finally broke. The sound that came from his throat was nothing like a word. It was pure emotion given voice, rage and protection, and heartbreak all compressed into a single, wordless cry that seemed to shake the very walls of the saloon. Wade released Rosa's wrist in surprise, stumbling backward in his chair. Every person in the room froze, transfixed by the unprecedented sound of Sheriff Brennan's mute son finding his voice, even if only to express what couldn't be contained in silence any longer. Samuel stood there, breathing heavily, his hands clenched at his sides. The sound had torn something open inside him, had created a crack in the dam that had held back 17 years of unspoken thoughts and feelings. Rosa stared at him in wonder, her hand moving instinctively to her wrist where Wade had grabbed her. In that wordless cry, she had heard everything Samuel couldn't say, his anger at her mistreatment, his respect for her dignity, his desperate wish that the world could be kinder to people like her. The saloon remained frozen in tableau, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Wade sat in his chair, suddenly sober, staring up at the young man who had just challenged him without speaking a single word, and Samuel, feeling the crack inside himself widening, knowing that something fundamental had changed, turned and walked out of the saloon with the same quiet dignity that Rosa brought to everything she did. But as he pushed through the bat-wing doors and stepped back into the desert evening, he carried with him the memory of Rosa's eyes, surprised, grateful, and for the first time since he'd been watching her, truly seeing him in return. The news of what happened at the Silver Dollar spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire in dry grass. By morning, everyone in town knew that Sheriff Brennan's mute son had made some kind of sound in defense of the Mexican cleaning woman. The details varied with each telling. Some said he'd shouted, others claimed he'd roared like a wild animal, but everyone agreed that something unprecedented had occurred. Samuel hadn't slept. He lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling as though something fundamental had shifted inside his chest. The sound he'd made, that raw, wordless expression of everything he'd been feeling, had left him changed. It was as if a door that had been locked for 17 years had suddenly revealed itself to be merely closed, waiting for the right moment to be opened. Sheriff Brennan sat at his kitchen table, nursing his morning coffee and watching his son pick at the breakfast Maria had prepared. The boy looked different somehow, more present, more aware of himself as a person who could affect the world around him rather than simply observe it. "You did a good thing yesterday," Tom said quietly, "standing up for Miss Martinez like that." Samuel looked up at his father, and for a moment Tom thought he might actually speak. There was something in his son's eyes, an urgency that hadn't been there before, as if words were pressing against his teeth like water against a dam. But the moment passed, and Samuel returned to his untouched eggs, though his mind was clearly elsewhere. Across town, Rosa was beginning her morning routine at the Silver Dollar, but everything felt different today. Wade Morrison had left on the dawn stage, reportedly sent away by his uncle after a heated discussion that had kept half the town awake. Big Jim had apologized to Rosa personally, something that had never happened in her 3 years of working there. But more than that, she found herself thinking about the sheriff's son, about the way he'd stood up for her, about the sound of anguish and protection that had torn itself from his throat. She had been defended before, usually by men who expected something in return for their chivalry. But there had been something different about Samuel's intervention, something pure and selfless that moved her in ways she hadn't expected. "You're distracted today," observed Maggie as they prepared for the lunch crowd. Rosa paused in her sweeping. "Just thinking." "About the sheriff's boy." Rosa looked at her friend with surprise. Maggie had always been perceptive, but sometimes her insights were uncomfortably accurate. He did a brave thing yesterday, Rosa said carefully. Yes, he did, Maggie agreed. Question is, what are you going to do about it? What do you mean? Maggie set down the glasses she'd been polishing and looked directly at Rosa. That boy has been watching you for weeks. Yesterday he found his voice, or something close to it, because he couldn't stand to see you mistreated. Now everyone in town is talking about it. You think he's going to just go back to standing across the street, pretending nothing happened? Rosa had been wondering the same thing herself. The dynamic between them had changed, had become something that couldn't be ignored or quietly observed from a distance. But she wasn't sure what that meant or what she was supposed to do about it. The afternoon brought its usual rhythm of customers, but Rosa found herself glancing toward the window more frequently than usual. Samuel wasn't in his usual spot across the street, and his absence felt more noticeable than his presence ever had. It wasn't until nearly closing time that she saw him again. He appeared in the doorway of the saloon just as she was wiping down the last of the tables, the evening crowd having dwindled to a few die-hard drinkers and card players. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the mostly empty room. Then Samuel stepped inside. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if each step required careful consideration. The few remaining patrons glanced up with interest. After yesterday's events, anything involving the sheriff's son was worth watching, but Samuel seemed oblivious to their attention. Rosa set down her cleaning rag and waited, her heart beating faster than it had any right to. There was something different about Samuel tonight, something purposeful that made the air around him seem charged with possibility. He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that she could hear his slightly unsteady breathing. For a long moment, they stood facing each other in the lamplight, two people who had been circling around an unspoken understanding for weeks. Samuel opened his mouth, and for a moment, Rosa thought he might make that same wordless sound from yesterday. But instead something else happened, something that would be talked about in Copper Ridge for years to come. Are you... His voice was rusty from disuse, barely above a whisper, but it was unmistakably a voice, unmistakably words. Are you all right? The question hung in the air between them like something precious and fragile. Rosa felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that this young man's first spoken words in a decade had been a question about her well-being. The entire saloon fell silent. Big Jim stopped polishing glasses. The card game at table 3 came to a complete halt. Even the drunk sleeping in the corner seemed to sense that something momentous was happening. Rosa looked into Samuel's face, saw the effort it had taken for him to form those simple words, saw the vulnerability in his expression as he waited for her response. She thought about all the people who had spoken to her over the years without really seeing her, all the words that had been wasted on cruelty or indifference. And here was someone who had saved his voice for 17 years, only to use it to ask if she was okay. Yes, she said softly, her accent more pronounced because of the emotion in her voice. I'm all right now. Samuel nodded, and she could see the relief in his posture, but he wasn't finished. Having broken through the barrier of silence, there seemed to be more that needed to be said. He shouldn't have... Samuel paused, struggling with words that felt foreign on his tongue. People shouldn't treat you like that. You're... He stopped, searching for the right words, then seemed to give up on eloquence in favor of simple truth. You're good, kind, you matter. The tears Rosa had been holding back finally spilled over. In all her 42 years, through marriage and widowhood, through poverty and hard work, and the daily indignities of being invisible to most of the world, no one had ever spoken to her with such simple, honest recognition of her worth as a human being. Thank you, she whispered. Samuel took a step closer, and Rosa could see that his hands were trembling slightly. Speaking was clearly an enormous effort for him, each word a victory over years of self-imposed silence. I see you, he said, the words coming a little easier now. every day. The way you're gentle with everyone, even when they don't deserve it. The way you work so hard and never complain. I see you and I think you're the best person in this whole town." The confession hung between them like a bridge built of honesty and respect. Rosa reached out without thinking and touched his hand, just briefly, just enough to let him know that his words had reached her. "And I see you," she said. "I've been seeing you for weeks now, standing out there, and I could tell you were different from other people, kinder, more thoughtful. I just never imagined that I could talk." Samuel's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "That your first words would be about me." They stood there in the lamplight, surrounded by the astonished silence of the silver dollar's remaining patrons. Two people who had found in each other something they hadn't even known they were looking for: recognition, respect, and the kind of pure human connection that transcended age, background, and the expectations of the world around them. Outside, Sheriff Brennan had arrived to investigate reports of his son speaking in the saloon. Through the window, he could see Samuel and Rosa talking quietly, could see the wonder on both their faces as words passed between them like gifts. Tom Brennan had spent 17 years wondering what his son's voice would sound like, what his first words might be. He had imagined many possibilities over the years, but he had never imagined this, that those words would be offered not to his father, but to a woman who had earned them through simple kindness and dignity. As he watched his son speak, really speak, for the first time since childhood, Sheriff Brennan felt his throat tighten with emotion. The words weren't for him, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that Samuel had found his voice at last, and he had chosen to use it in service of something beautiful, the defense of someone who deserved defending, the recognition of someone who deserved recognition. In the Silver Dollar Saloon, as the desert night settled over Copper Ridge, two people who had been invisible to most of the world finally saw each other clearly and found that they were not invisible at all, just waiting for the right moment, the right person, to finally be seen. And in that seeing, in those first precious words spoken after years of silence, something new was born, not just a voice, but a connection that would change both their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine, but were brave enough to discover together.